Well, I'm back in Lidditz after last week sharing from chapter 5 in the book Calvary Road while sitting outside a hotel in Carlsbad, California. Now I'm back here where there are only fake trees in this part of the lobby versus a real palm tree in the background. We are 1 week away from what would be part of the Holy Week. And as we continue on this journey of looking through what it looks like to be on Calvary's Road, a path to your own personal revival, today we're going to be looking at how does revival happen in our homes. And Roy Hession, again, is writing this in 1950, and as an observation of what he saw going on in revivals around the world, and writing various articles and then collecting them together into one book. And one of the observations he had was that as part of personal revival is that not only does it begin in your own heart, but it also begins in the place where you do life more with anybody else, and that is in your own household, among your family, those who you live with. So perhaps you're at a stage of life where you have a bunch of roommates or housemates. Others of you, maybe you're empty nesters. Some of you have children, or some of you are anticipating that in the future. Reality is, if you're married or you're still living at home with parents, it's in those relationships that is the first test of what God's doing in your heart as to how far it will be manifested in the way you live. And so Roy noticed that the people who were experiencing true revival, not only did it begin in their hearts, but the first manifestation outwardly was among those they lived with. And so he makes this statement towards the beginning of the chapter. He says, "Let us remind ourselves again of what revival really is. It simply means new life in hearts where spiritual life has ebbed. It is not a man's life, but God's life, the life of Jesus filling us and flowing through us. That life is manifested in fellowship and oneness with those with whom we live. Nothing between us and God, and nothing between us and others. The home is the place where, before all others, where this should be experienced." So, a test of how far that penetrating work of Christ has come in your heart will show up by the healed aspects of the relationship you have with those you live among. And so he brings up two things that become hindrances as part of the journey of right relatedness, or that healing that happens between us and those we live with. And the first thing is that we fail to really be open with one another. It's not easy to just lay bare what might be going on inside of you that is broken, or is hindered, or is harmed, is hurting, or acknowledging anger or frustration. Sometimes we do those things, and it's usually out of an emotive point of rage or anger, but never for the sake of being vulnerable, or rarely, I should say, for being vulnerable and transparent. And what Roy's taking notice of as he's traveled the world and seen revival happen on the various continents is that as God's doing a deep work in your heart, the one that should be most impacted by that are those you live with, in particular your spouse if you're married, or friends you might live in a home with, perhaps even a brother or sister. In those relationships that often can face harm, brokenness, because of just the close relatedness and being in the same household, it's easy to just dismiss that as being a place of honesty, a place of vulnerability. But yet, maybe that's where it speeds up more than any other place, the inner work and transformation of God, because it requires the greatest amount of courage to begin there. It sounds strange to say it takes more courage to begin to be vulnerable at home, but there's a lot more at risk and at stake in those relationships than in any others. And so that's why I believe we tend to maybe provide a veil or a barrier between those we live among. So in this journey, Roy acknowledges that the person who's going to experience revival not only in their heart but in their household, it needs to begin with being vulnerable and transparent with one another, sharing where each other are at, and so that you can truly pray for one another, perhaps even forgive one another, find healing in those relationships. Because what he's advocating for in this book is that, and as we've taught through in the Beatitudes, righteousness is not only right relatedness between us and God, it's right relatedness between us and others. And there's no more important relationships than those you live with. And so it must begin with that transparency, the truthfulness, the vulnerability, not for the sake of correcting another, but for the honesty of where your heart's at, so that the other can understand where you're at and know how to speak into it and find common ground. The second thing he mentions, beyond just the fact of needing to be honest with each other, is truly loving each other. Loving in the sense that the scriptures speak to. And he draws from this passage in 1 Corinthians 13. We know it as the love passage. But what he did is he took verses 4 to 7 and then asked us to apply it in terms of the context of those we live with. So let me read those verses. It says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres." So let's apply this in terms of the context of home. Love is patient. Where would you say it's most obvious that your patience runs thin with somebody else? My guess is with somebody at home. If it's not somebody at home, it might be somebody that you have close contact with regularly, perhaps at work. But home is often a place where that patience is challenged. How about the terms love is also kind? It's really easy to give the cold treatment or the silent treatment to somebody in your household. To not really consider what it looks like to be kind in this moment, doing kind acts that are unexpected. We often presume on each other. It's like we don't put that dish in the dishwasher when you know your spouse might prefer you do that, or to rinse out the dishes, or to put away the food. Just doing those acts of kindness, we tend to just presume on each other, well, the other person will do it. But love says, if I know something's going to be received well, I will kindly do it. How about love is not boastful or proud? It's real easy to boast about your day at home or your accomplishments. Siblings often deal with this issue. But sometimes it can go into the spousal relationship, where one works at one place and one works at another. Sometimes there's a rubbing in of what the other's accomplished. Or how about love does not dishonor the other person? It doesn't self-seek. Again, I think this is subtlety that happens in the household. We tend to go through the house not being considerate of the others in the house. We presume upon them regularly. They'll do it, or they can take care of it, or I just don't care. We'll just be very lazy or flippant. But love says it's always considerate. It's always considering the other and how it can serve the other well. Also keeps no record of wrongs or is easily angered. Again, if you have a lot of history with somebody you're living with, it's easy to continue to build this and stack all the airs and then explode inexplicably in this one moment. But that's what happens at home. But then again, it concludes with saying love always protects, is always looking out for the others, is trustworthy of trust, and is hopeful and perseveres. When you start looking at those things as the means by which God defines love, when you consider the thread of revival that's going on in your heart, being able to truly transform you, it leads to being transparent and honest before others, but it also becomes more loving, because that's what God is. 1 John 4, God is love. There is not an impossibility. It says, according to that text, it is impossible for you to claim to love God who you cannot see, but then yet withhold love from a brother or sister whom you can see. In fact, John says, you're a liar if you claim to love God, but you don't know how to love well those that you live with and can see. Roy makes this statement in this passage saying, we have to be able to acknowledge that sin is sin. So when we choose not to love as the standard of love that's listed here in 1 Corinthians 13, that God says, this is the type of love I am calling you to. And when we fail to love those in our household that way, it is sin. We fall short there, and we're in need of acknowledging that sin and in need of God's intervention in our hearts. Because again, revival, as defined what I read earlier, is God in you and you less of. So it's removing that flesh and selfish mindset and replacing it with the heart and love of God, which is going to be more often other-centered in the way it manifests itself. So as the precious blood of Christ, as what Roy says, the precious blood of Christ cleanses us from the unlove and the ill will, the Holy Spirit will fill us with the very nature then of Jesus. So as we empty ourselves of all these things that tend to be opposite of love, then what gets replaced then is the nature of Christ himself, who gave up of himself so that he could manifest more greatly the love that he and the Father has for us. And so to come to such a place, Roy concludes with these thoughts. He says, when we have become broken at Calvary, so at the cross, we must be willing to put things right with others, sometimes even with children, those that maybe as parents we have. This is so often the test then of a true broken heart, is when we can then come to a person in our households and say, I was wrong. I am sorry. We set aside our selfish ambitions and we begin to operate in terms of other-mindedness. In fact, what he says here is that brokenness is the opposite of hardness. Hardness says it's your fault. Brokenness, however, says it's my fault. What a difference an atmosphere that will begin to prevail in our homes when we begin to hear ourselves saying that. Let us remember that at the cross there is only room for one at a time. We cannot say, I was wrong, but you are wrong too. You must come as well. No, you must go alone saying, I am wrong. God will work in the other person, but more than that, he needs to work in you to break you. So brokenness has to begin in you. Let God take care of the other person's soul. Own the fact that maybe love has not been the motivator and the operation by which you've been in your home. That others have experienced more your selfishness, not your love. And then call it out for what it is. It's sin. When you can call that unlovingness sin, then it breaks your heart and it causes you to go to Jesus and say, I am wrong. Change this in me. So final statement that Roy says is sin is almost the only thing we have in common with everyone else. And so at the feet of Jesus, where sin is cleansed, it is the only place where we can be truly one. Real oneness conjures up for us the picture of two or more sinners together at Calvary. So if you're desiring to have personal revival and have God transform you, often that journey begins at home. And when you can begin to allow the brokenness to be experienced in your own heart for your selfishness and the sin that resides in you, then what God is doing in you can begin to come to others in your household. Because then they can come to the cross and say, I'm at fault. I am wrong. And when sin gets confronted in that manner and we're all being transparent together, revival has come to your home. Your selfishness is being replaced by the very nature of Jesus. Let that be so in our households, especially as we anticipate the moment of Calvary that happens next Maundy, Thursday, and then ultimately Easter, where we celebrate the resurrected Savior. May his grace and peace be in your life and spread to the rest of those who live in your home. Amen.